All right, today we're tackling a really tough one. A conflict that's so complex and honestly often gets lost in the shadow of the wars that came before it. We're talking about a story that picks up right at the end of one of the absolute darkest chapters of the 20th century, the Cambodian genocide. Mark this date, January 7th, 1979. This is the day it all changed. Vietnamese tanks are rolling into Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital. But the city they found, it was almost completely empty. A total ghost town, just haunted by the absolute horror of the last 4 years. Just look at this number, 1.5 to 2 million people. That's how many are estimated to have died under the Khmer Rouge. I mean, think about that. Between 1975 and 1979, Pol Pot's regime either murdered or worked to death nearly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population. All in this fanatical, insane quest to create some kind of radical agrarian society. So yeah, the fall of Phnom Penh marked the end of this nightmare. But it wasn't just an ending. It was also the beginning of something else. A brutal 10-year war that would suck in superpowers and basically divide the entire world. So how on earth did a liberation from genocide lead straight into another massive conflict? Well, that's the big question we're going to unpack.
Okay, so first things first, let's really get a handle on what exactly ended on that day. We're talking about the swift, total collapse of Pol Pot's nightmare state, the so-called Democratic Kampuchea.
Believe it or not, it only took about 2 weeks. The Vietnamese military, along with some Cambodian rebels, just shattered the Khmer Rouge army. And when they marched into the capital, wow, it was just eerie, totally deserted. Because remember, the Khmer Rouge had forced everyone out of the cities years before. What the soldiers found instead were the horrifying leftovers of the regime's crimes, places like the infamous Tuol Sleng prison, where thousands upon thousands had been tortured. You can only imagine, for the starving survivors who started emerging from hiding, these Vietnamese troops looked like absolute saviors. And that right there brings us to the absolute heart of this whole story. See, Vietnam and the Khmer Rouge, they were both communist movements. They were supposed to be allies. They had fought side by side against the US-backed regimes in their own countries. So what went so horribly wrong? Right. How did this happen? How do you go from being brothers in arms to bitter, mortal enemies? The answer, as you'll see, is this toxic stew of ancient animosity, really extreme ideology, and of course, big-time geopolitical games. Okay, let's break this down. On one side, you have the Khmer Rouge. They were led by Pol Pot, and they were, to put it mildly, deeply paranoid. They had this centuries-old resentment of Vietnam, and they were terrified of being swallowed up into some big Indo-Chinese federation run by Hanoi. And their nationalism was so extreme, they started laying claim to huge parts of southern Vietnam. To back this up, they cozied up to China to try and counter their powerful neighbor. Now, on the other side, you've got Vietnam. They kind of saw themselves as the big brother, the leader of communism in the region. And they were getting seriously alarmed by the Khmer Rouge's sheer brutality, their internal purges, and their constant aggression.
And that paranoia, well, it didn't stay paranoia for long. It exploded into open aggression. I mean, almost right after they took power in 1975, the Khmer Rouge started launching attacks on Vietnamese territory. And listen, these were not just little border skirmishes. We're talking brutal massacres of civilians. The Bat Chuk massacre in 1978 was just unbelievably horrific. Over 3,000 people slaughtered in their own village. For Vietnam, that was it. That was the final straw. On Christmas Day 1978, they launched a full-scale invasion. And this is where the story gets really messy. This is where the whole narrative splits in two, depending on your point of view. Was Vietnam's invasion a noble humanitarian intervention to stop a genocide? Or was it a self-interested occupation of a weaker neighbor? Yeah, there is no easy answer here. And who you ask completely changes the story you get. The thing is, both sides of this debate, they have some pretty powerful evidence. Okay, so first, let's look at the case for liberators. And it's a strong one. The Vietnamese invasion, without a doubt, stopped the killing fields. Full stop. It brought an end to one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Their soldiers handed out food to a population that was literally on the brink of starvation. And they were the ones who exposed the regime's horrors, like Tuol Sleng, to the rest of the world. For so many Cambodians in that exact moment, the sight of a Vietnamese tank meant one thing: survival. But then there's the other side of the coin. Vietnam didn't just leave. They immediately installed a new government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which was run by Cambodian defectors who were completely loyal to Hanoi. And then they stayed for a decade. They had Vietnamese advisors plugged into every single ministry, basically running the country from behind the scenes. And over those 10 years, that initial feeling of gratitude, it started to sour. It turned into widespread resentment of what felt like a foreign occupation. You know, a conflict like this was never going to stay local. Not back then. It quickly spilled way beyond Cambodia's borders and became a full-blown proxy battle in the last really intense phase of the Cold War. The world was forced to choose a side. And honestly, the alliances that formed were, well, they were pretty shocking. So check this out. It was a classic Cold War setup. Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union. Okay, so that meant China, the Soviets' biggest rival, immediately backed the Khmer Rouge. They even launched their own brief, bloody invasion of northern Vietnam just to punish them. But here's the part that is just mind-blowing. The United States and its Western allies, obsessed with stopping anything Soviet-backed, effectively sided with the Khmer Rouge. Yeah, you heard that right. They did this by making sure that the deposed genocidal regime kept Cambodia's official seat at the United Nations. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. Because of Cold War politics, the actual genocidal regime was recognized as the legitimate government of Cambodia, and the country that stopped the genocide, they got hit with crippling international sanctions and were totally isolated. It is one of the darkest, most twisted ironies of modern history. So, for the next 10 years, Vietnam found itself stuck, bogged down in Cambodia, fighting this exhausting guerrilla war against a coalition of resistance forces. And that coalition included, you guessed it, the regrouped Khmer Rouge, who are now being supplied by China and given shelter across the border in Thailand. And the cost for Vietnam was just immense. The country was already impoverished from its own long wars, and now it was pouring money and resources it just didn't have into Cambodia. We're talking about an estimated 25,000 Vietnamese soldiers killed, with tens of thousands more wounded. And get this, at its peak, the occupation was eating up a staggering 1/3 of Vietnam's entire national budget. So by the late 1980s, something had to give. Vietnam's main supporter, the Soviet Union, was starting to crumble, and Vietnam's own economy was in total ruins. They just knew they couldn't sustain this occupation anymore. The international isolation was just too much to bear. It was time to find a way out. That long road to peace finally began in 1989, when Vietnam pulled out its last combat troops. That move opened the door for the huge Paris Peace Accords in 1991, which actually brought all the warring Cambodian factions to the same table. From there, the UN stepped in, launching one of its biggest peacekeeping missions ever to disarm the fighters and oversee the country's first democratic elections in 1993. And with that, a very fragile peace was finally restored to the nation. But, the end of the war wasn't some simple, happily ever after moment. Not even close. The peace was incredibly fragile. The scars from decades of violence, from the Civil War, the genocide, and the occupation, they ran so deep. The country was still just full of tension and distrust. So, when you look back at all this, it leaves us with a really tough, uncomfortable question. A nation stopped a genocide, but the world punished them for it. What does that teach us about the tangled mess of international intervention? I mean, when is it right for one country to invade another, even if it's to stop a horrible atrocity? And what happens when geopolitics makes allies out of monsters and turns liberators into outcasts? It's a question that, honestly, is just as relevant today as it was back in 1979.